Hey guys, tonight we travel back to one of the most misunderstood, romanticized, and genuinely terrifying institutions the ancient world ever produced, the Roman Gladiator School. You've seen the movies. You've got a vague mental image of Russell Crowe looking heroic in the dust, muscles gleaming, crowd roaring, and you're thinking, yeah, okay, I could do that. I could absolutely do that. And tonight, gently but thoroughly, we are going to dismantle that illusion one sandal strap at a time. Because the truth is, you probably wouldn't last a day. Not a full day. Maybe not even a full morning. And that's okay. Neither would most people who actually lived in ancient Rome, which is saying something, because those people were considerably tougher than you and I combined. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing that someone in a quiet apartment in Manila or a cozy bedroom in rural Canada is drifting off to ancient Rome with me tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It is somewhere around the 2nd century CE, and you are standing outside a set of heavy wooden gates reinforced with iron brackets, somewhere in the sun-scorched outskirts of Capua, Italy. The air smells like sawdust, old leather, and something else. Something harder to name, something metallic and animal, that settles at the back of your throat and doesn't quite leave. The walls around you are high. Not decoratively high, not architecturally ambitious high. Functionally, deliberately keep people in high. You notice immediately that the walls lean inward at the top, just slightly, the way walls do when their primary job is containment rather than aesthetics. This is the ludus, the gladiatorial training school, and the gates are already swinging open. The word ludus in Latin technically means school or game or play. Romans used it for children's schools, for recreational activities, for the kind of light, pleasant pastimes that fill an afternoon. Historians still argue whether this was a deliberate piece of Roman doublespeak, a way of softening the brutal reality of what these institutions actually were, or simply a reflection of how deeply Romans had normalized the entire enterprise of professional combat training. Either way, standing here now, nothing about this place says play to you. The gates groan. Someone shouts something in rapid Latin, and you walk in. The Ludus Capuae, the training school at Capua, was one of the most famous in the entire Roman world, and for reasons that are not entirely flattering to its reputation. This was the school from which the Great Slave Revolt of 73 BCE erupted, led by a Thracian gladiator named Spartacus and 2 Gallic fighters named Crixus and Oenomaus. Somewhere between 70 and 80 gladiators broke out of this very facility using kitchen implements, spits and cleavers, according to the ancient sources, overpowered their guards, seized a wagon carrying gladiatorial weapons, and sparked a rebellion that would tie the Roman military in knots for nearly 3 years and terrify the Senate into a prolonged, collective panic. So yes, this is that place. The one where the walls, presumably, were subsequently made somewhat higher. You take your first steps into the interior courtyard and stop, because you need a moment to recalibrate everything you thought you knew about what this would look like. You expected chaos. You expected noise and aggression and the cinematic thunder of weapons clashing. What you find instead is something almost eerily organized. The courtyard is large and roughly rectangular, its floor packed hard with sand and clay, and around its perimeter there are wooden posts, tall, thick, planted deep, that you will come to know very well in the coming days, because those posts are your primary training partners for the foreseeable future. They are called paulus, and they are as close to a friend as this place is going to offer you in the short term. Men are already at work, dozens of them, spread across the space in a loose but purposeful arrangement, each doing something specific, moving through weapon forms, practicing footwork patterns, or simply standing in positions of controlled tension that look restful but absolutely are not. Nobody is chatting. Nobody is leaning on anything. The trainers, the doctors, move between them with an attention that is professional and entirely humorless, and when one of them catches you standing there gaping like a tourist who's wandered into the wrong tour, the look on his face suggests that your sightseeing window has just closed. There is, you notice, a smell beneath the sawdust and leather smell from outside. Something warmer. Sweat, yes, obviously sweat, but also something like rendered fat and herbal smoke and the faint green bitterness of medicinal plants. The Ludus has its own medical facility. It has its own kitchen. It has sleeping quarters and storage and administrative offices and what amounts to a small, self-contained economy. This is not a dungeon. It is not a prison exactly, though it is also not nothing like a prison. It is an institution, total, organized, complete, and it has been running long enough to have developed opinions about every aspect of your existence. The Roman gladiatorial system was, by the height of the imperial period, a remarkably sophisticated commercial enterprise. The major ludi were not backyard operations. Archaeologists excavating the gladiatorial barracks at Pompeii, preserved under Vesuvius's ash since 79 CE, found a facility with 70-odd individual cells, a central courtyard almost certainly used for training, cooking facilities, storage, and evidence of administrative record-keeping. They also found the skeleton of a woman wearing expensive jewelry in one of the cells, which raises all kinds of questions that the archaeological record is not in a position to fully answer, but which does suggest that the social world of the Ludus was considerably more complicated than the movies tend to portray. A man approaches you now. He is not enormous, not the barrel-chested giant you perhaps imagined, but he moves with a kind of precise, weighted economy that tells you every step he takes is exactly as long as he intends it to be. He is the lanista, or at least one of his representatives, and he is looking at you the way a craftsman looks at raw material, not unkindly, but with an assessment that is entirely practical. He is thinking about what you might become. He is not yet thinking about who you are. In Roman social reality, the lanista occupied a peculiar and somewhat uncomfortable position. He was, in practical terms, a businessman, often quite a wealthy one, who invested capital in human beings, trained them, fed them, medicated them, and then hired them out to magistrates and politicians and wealthy sponsors who wanted to put on public games. The lanista owned or controlled the gladiators under his authority, negotiated their contracts, managed their careers, and collected a significant portion of their earnings and the fees paid for their appearance. He was, in effect, a sports agent and a prison warden simultaneously, and Roman society rewarded him financially for this while simultaneously looking down on him socially. The legal and social stigma attached to the profession was real and documented, placing the lanista in the company of other infames, people of low social reputation despite potentially high income, alongside actors and prostitutes. This particular detail delights historians because it reveals something wonderfully contradictory about Roman attitudes toward the arena. The games were beloved. The gladiators were celebrated. The spectacle was considered an expression of Roman virtue, power, and civic generosity. And yet the man who actually made all of it possible, who trained the fighters, kept them alive, and delivered them to the sand, was somebody you wouldn't invite to a respectable dinner party. Historians still argue whether this reflects a genuine moral ambivalence about the violence at the heart of Roman entertainment culture, or simply the standard Roman instinct to maintain social hierarchies even when the underlying logic had stopped making sense. The lanista's representative, let's call him what he probably was, an administrative overseer with the title of curator or similar, gestures for you to follow him. You follow because this is not a situation in which declining the gesture is a meaningful option. He leads you across the courtyard, past the men at their training posts, past a low building that produces the herbal smoke smell you noticed earlier, and through a doorway into a cooler, dimmer space that functions as the intake area. There are other new arrivals here. You notice them the way you notice people in a waiting room, peripheral, uncertain, each quietly processing their own version of this situation. Some look frightened. A couple look determined in the specific way that frightened people look when they have decided that looking determined is preferable. One man, sitting against the far wall with his arms folded and his expression utterly unreadable, looks like he has simply decided to suspend all emotional response until he has more information. You make a mental note to stay near that man. What happens next, the intake process, is where your transformation from whoever you were yesterday into whatever this place is going to make you begins in earnest. And it begins, as most truly humbling experiences do, with someone writing things down about you. Your height is measured. Your weight is estimated with a practiced squeeze of the upper arm and a look at your legs that is more agricultural than medical. Somebody notes the condition of your hands, specifically whether they suggest prior labor or whether they are, as yours perhaps are, somewhat suspiciously soft. Your teeth are checked. Your eyes are checked. You are asked through a translator if necessary about prior injuries, prior training, prior experience with weapons of any kind. The Romans were not sentimental about their investment, but they were serious about it, and a gladiator who collapsed in the first week of training because nobody had noticed the chronic knee injury was a financial loss the Ludus had no interest in absorbing. And underneath all of this practical cataloging, something else is happening. Something quieter and more significant. The process of intake at a Roman gladiatorial school was, functionally, the process of becoming a different kind of person, or at least a person with a different kind of legal and social status. Whether you arrived as a slave purchased specifically for gladiatorial training, as a prisoner of war assigned to the arena by Roman military authority, as a criminal condemned to the games by a court, or, and this is the part people always find surprising, as a free volunteer who had signed a contract agreeing to submit to the Ludus's discipline in exchange for pay and food and the chance at glory, the intake process marked a transition. You became, in the legal terminology, someone who had surrendered a portion of their normal rights. The Octoramentum, the contract signed by volunteer gladiators, was not a casual document. It contained language in which the signatory formally agreed to submit to being burned, bound, beaten, and killed with iron, which is about as unambiguous as a contract gets. Free volunteers were not common, but they were real, and they were legally required to go through this formal submission because Roman law took seriously the question of what you were actually agreeing to. You were agreeing to something that would have been considered degrading even by Roman standards, the surrender of your person to another's authority in the most total sense. And the law wanted that agreement on record. You stand in the intake room, and the overseer finishes writing, and he looks at you with an expression that communicates, not unkindly, that you are now a project. Tomorrow, he explains through the translator, the morning bell rings before first light. You will rise with it. You will eat. You will train. You will learn. You look around the dim room, at the high walls visible through the small window, at the other new arrivals with their various expressions of uncertainty, at the careful, organized machinery of this ancient institution already processing you like grain through a mill. The gates, you realize, have closed behind you. And just like that, your old life is on the other side of a wall, and this, whatever this is, has already begun. The overseer leaves you in the intake room with a clay lamp, a thin wool blanket, and absolutely no further instructions, which turns out to be its own kind of instruction. The message is clear enough. Figure out the basics yourself, because nobody here is going to hold your hand through the disorientation of your first night. You find a sleeping space along the wall. A low wooden platform with a straw-filled mat that is neither comfortable nor completely unbearable, which you will eventually come to regard as one of the finer luxuries this place has to offer, and you lie down in the guttering lamplight and listen to the sounds of the Ludus settling around you. It is louder than you expected, even at night. Not chaotic, never chaotic, you are already learning that chaos is not something this place tolerates, but alive with the specific sounds of a large number of human beings existing in close quarters under institutional authority. Somewhere down a corridor, two men are talking in low voices in a language you don't recognize, possibly Thracian or one of the Gallic dialects. The conversation too quiet and too fast to follow. Something clanks against stone, a chain, maybe, or a piece of equipment being moved by a night guard. Outside in the courtyard, you can hear footsteps making their regular circuit. The Ludus does not sleep entirely, keeps one eye open. You close yours, and somewhere in the warm dark you think, I can do this. And bless your heart genuinely for that thought, because morning is going to have some thoughts of its own on the subject. But before morning comes, and before the bell shatters whatever thin sleep you've managed to collect, there is something important happening in this dim, quiet room that deserves your attention. Something that began during intake and is continuing now, invisibly, in the gap between who you were and who this place is going to require you to be. The Romans had a word for the total transformation demanded of someone entering the gladiatorial life. It wasn't a single word, actually, but a cluster of concepts that together described a kind of social death and rebirth. You were leaving behind your previous identity, your name, your history, your standing in the world, and being remade into something new. Something the Romans had a very specific set of expectations about. The first and most immediate piece of this transformation was the name. Gladiators in the Roman world almost universally fought and trained and lived under names that were not their birth names. These were arena names, professional identities constructed to say something specific about the fighter's persona, origin, fighting style, or the image the lanista wanted to project to paying audiences. The naming conventions followed recognizable patterns. Many gladiators received names that referenced their geographic or ethnic origins, real or constructed. Thracian-style fighters might be given names that sounded appropriately foreign and fierce to Roman ears, while others received names from Roman mythology or history that carried connotations of strength and martial virtue. Names like Hermes, Flamma, Hilaris, Tetraites, these appear in inscriptions, graffiti, and literary sources across the Roman world, and they tell us that the gladiatorial persona was a carefully managed public identity, not simply the man behind it. This matters for you specifically because sometime during your first full day, possibly during intake, possibly in the morning, you are going to be given a name. Or rather, a name is going to be assigned to you the way equipment is assigned, because that is essentially what it is, equipment. Professional designation. The overseer who handled your intake has already made some preliminary assessment of your physical type, your apparent temperament, and the vague category of fighter he thinks you might be trainable into, and that assessment has already shaped whatever name is coming your way. If you are tall and heavyset, with the kind of build that suggests raw power over agility, you might receive a name that leans into that, something solid and forceful, a name that sounds like it hits things. If you are quicker and leaner, the calculus shifts. The Romans were not subtle about this. The gladiatorial marketplace was a real marketplace, and names were part of the product. Here is the quietly strange part. For many gladiators, particularly those who had been slaves, the arena name represented not a loss but a peculiar kind of gain. A slave had no legal name in the meaningful sense. A slave had a designation, something their owner called them, which could be changed at the owner's whim and which conferred no social standing whatsoever. The arena name, by contrast, was public. It appeared on painted advertisements posted around city walls. It was spoken by crowds in amphitheaters. It was scratched into wax tablets by fans and admirers. It was, in a very real sense, a more substantial identity than anything the slave system had previously offered, which is one of the deeply uncomfortable ironies embedded in the entire institution. Historians still argue whether gladiators who achieved significant fame, the ones whose names became recognizable across multiple cities and whose appearance at the games was advertised weeks in advance, experienced anything resembling what we might call celebrity identity, or whether the fundamental conditions of their existence made such psychological comfort impossible. The evidence suggests it was complicated, as it always is when you're trying to understand the inner lives of people who mostly didn't write their own accounts. What the evidence is much clearer about is the physical dimension of the transformation, specifically what happened to your body during intake. The Romans cut your hair, not stylistically, not as a fashion choice, but practically and thoroughly, because long hair in combat is a liability and because the act of cutting itself carried meaning. Across dozens of ancient cultures, the removal of hair at moments of transition, enslavement, imprisonment, initiation into religious orders, entry into military service, was a recognized ritual of identity change. You probably know this instinctively if you've ever watched a military induction film, or read anything about monastic traditions, or thought about why every institution that wants to remake a person starts with the outside of their head. The Romans were not unique in this, but they were deliberate about it. Your civilian clothing was taken. Whatever you arrived in, tunic, cloak, sandals, whatever small personal objects you had on your person, was inventoried, stored, and replaced with the standard issue clothing of the ludus, a basic linen sublegaculum, the wrapped loincloth that served as the foundational garment of gladiatorial life and training, and a simple tunic for when you weren't actively on the training floor. The quality of this clothing was not luxurious, but it was adequate, which was precisely the point. Adequacy was the baseline the ludus maintained. Not suffering, not comfort, adequacy. Keeping you functional was an economic necessity. Making you comfortable was not. Your personal objects, if you had any, if you'd arrived with anything, occupied a legal gray area that the Romans had thought about more carefully than you might expect. Gladiators, even enslaved ones, could in practice accumulate a kind of personal property over time, gifts from admirers, prize money, the small economies of institutional life. There are records of gladiators owning objects, making small purchases, even sending money to family members outside the ludus. But at intake, none of that applied yet. At intake, you arrived with whatever you had, and the institution decided what role those objects would play in your new existence, which in most cases was a very small role. The sleeping quarters you've been assigned tell their own story about your new social position. The barracks at various excavated ludi show a consistent architectural logic. Individual cells or small shared rooms, each with basic sleeping provision, arranged around the central training courtyard in a configuration that combines surveillance with function. You were close to the training space, convenient for the institution but also visible, accessible, trackable. The guards who made their rounds through the night were not there only for your protection, though protection was genuinely part of their function. Gladiators were expensive. Gladiators who injured each other in the middle of the night over a personal dispute were a financial problem. The night watch existed to protect the investment as much as to enforce order. What strikes you lying on your straw mat in the dark is how total the system is. Every element of your physical existence, where you sleep, what you wear, what you will eat in the morning, when you will wake, what your name is going to be, has been absorbed into an institutional logic that predates you and will continue after you. You are not the first person to lie on this platform wondering what tomorrow holds. You are one in a very long line, and the line stretches back further than you can see. The Romans were operating ludi by at least the 3rd century BCE, though the formal, organized gladiatorial school as a distinct institution probably developed somewhat later. Capua's prominence as a training center predated the imperial period significantly, and by the time the empire hit its stride, the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, there were imperial ludi in Rome itself, funded directly by the emperor's household and operating under imperial administrative authority. The Ludus Magnus, adjacent to the Colosseum in Rome, was connected to the arena by an underground tunnel, which is either the most practical piece of urban planning you've ever heard of or the most ominous, depending on your perspective. Archaeology has given us a partial picture of what daily life in these facilities looked like in material terms. At the Pompeii barracks, excavators found not only the structural remains of the facility but objects, weapons and armor fragments, personal items, the bones of a horse. The horse remains somewhat mysterious, and the remains of at least 63 individuals, including women and children, who appear to have been sheltering in the gladiatorial barracks when Vesuvius erupted. This tells us that the barracks were not hermetically sealed from the surrounding community. People came and went, relationships existed, the social world inside the walls connected to the social world outside in ways that the institutional architecture doesn't fully communicate. There were gladiators who lived inside the ludus full-time for years. There were others who, particularly as they gained seniority and reputation, were permitted varying degrees of freedom, allowed to leave the facility for certain purposes, to maintain households nearby, to have families in the conventional sense. The rules shifted with status, and status shifted with survival and performance, and so the incentive structure of the entire system pointed in a consistent direction. Get better, last longer, and the walls get somewhat more permeable. But you are not there yet. You are at the beginning, which means the walls are very much solid, and the bell is going to ring before you feel ready for it, and the transformation that intake began is going to continue in the morning with considerably more physical emphasis. There is one more thing that happens during this first night that deserves mention, and it is something the historical sources touch on only glancingly but which seems significant from a human perspective. At some point, maybe in the evening before sleep, maybe in the early dark, the men around you begin to talk. Quietly, carefully, in whatever languages overlap. Not about strategy or training or the future. About where they came from. A fishing village on the Adriatic coast. A farm in what is now southern France. A city in North Africa whose name means nothing to the Roman administrators who process their intake paperwork but means everything to the man lying 3 platforms away from you in the dark. These conversations were the thing that the institution could not entirely strip away, because stripping it away would have required stripping away the thing that made the fighters psychologically functional. And a gladiator who had no inner life was a gladiator who couldn't summon the will to fight. The Romans understood this with the practical clarity they brought to most things. They could take your name and your clothes and your previous social identity, but they needed to leave you enough personhood to make you dangerous in the sand. So they left you the dark, and the quiet conversations, and the thin straw mat, and the knowledge that tomorrow the bell would ring and the real work would begin. You pull the wool blanket up, and the clay lamp flickers, and somewhere outside the walls the city of Capua is going about its evening with no particular awareness of what is happening inside this well-organized, high-walled, iron-bracketed building on its outskirts. The lamp goes out. You are, for the first time, genuinely, completely inside the ludus. And in the morning, everything changes again. The bell does not ease you awake. It does not suggest wakefulness or gently propose that consciousness might be worth considering. It detonates. A single iron tone, hard and flat, bouncing off every stone surface in the facility simultaneously, arriving in your ears with the social grace of a thrown brick. One moment you are in whatever thin, anxious approximation of sleep you manage to assemble, and the next moment you are sitting upright on your straw mat with your heart doing something that should probably be evaluated by a medical professional, and the room around you is already moving. The other men are up. Not groggily, not with the human fumbling that you associate with early mornings, the lost sandal, the wrong direction, the desperate pause for orientation, but with a practiced speed that tells you they have been here long enough for the bell to have reprogrammed something in their nervous systems. They move toward the doorway without apparent thought, the way water moves downhill, and you scramble to follow because the alternative is being the only person still sitting on their mat when the doctors come through, and you have already correctly identified that as a situation to avoid. Outside, the courtyard is gray and cold. Not cold by the standards of Northern Europe or anywhere that has experienced a real winter, but cold by the standards of a body that was horizontal 30 seconds ago and is now standing in an Italian pre-dawn in a linen subligaculum with no warming-up period whatsoever. The sky above the high walls is the particular dark blue of very early morning, just light enough to see by, and the training floor stretches before you with its wooden paulus posts standing in their rows like patient, judgmental sentinels. You have approximately 15 minutes before training begins. In those 15 minutes, you eat. The morning meal at the ludus is not a leisurely affair. There is no table, not in the sense you're imagining. There is a distribution, a ladle, a bowl, a portion, and the food itself is something that is going to require a brief moment of recalibration on your part. It is porridge, essentially thick and grain-heavy, made primarily from barley with some legumes mixed through, possibly some herbs, possibly some boiled vegetables depending on what the kitchen has available. It is warm. It is filling in the dense, slow-burning way that serious physical work requires. It is not, by any reasonable modern culinary assessment, delicious. But here is the thing about that porridge that you don't know yet, and that is going to be one of the genuinely surprising historical footnotes of your time here. This diet is actually the subject of real scholarly investigation and some fascinating conclusions. Researchers analyzing the skeletal remains of gladiators excavated in Ephesus, a Roman city on the western coast of what is now Turkey, where a significant gladiatorial cemetery was discovered in the 1990s, conducted isotopic analysis of the bones and found evidence consistent with a diet extremely high in plant protein and carbohydrates, specifically barley, and very low in animal protein. The gladiatorial diet was, in the terms a modern nutritionist would recognize, heavily plant-based. So heavily, in fact, that ancient sources apparently nicknamed gladiators hordearii, barley men, which is either affectionate or mildly insulting depending on the tone of voice and probably both simultaneously. The reason for this diet was not philosophical. The Romans weren't running an ancient wellness retreat with a commitment to ethical eating. The high carbohydrate load served a specific physical purpose. It built a layer of subcutaneous fat over the developed muscle underneath. This fat layer functioned as a kind of biological armor. It meant that the shallow cuts that were the most common result of arena combat, the cuts designed to draw blood and entertain the crowd without necessarily ending a fight, produced dramatic visual spectacle without immediately compromising the fighter's physical function. A cut through fat bleeds impressively. A cut through muscle disables. The diet was, in this sense, a practical engineering solution to a very specific performance requirement. You eat your barley porridge. It is, you admit, more substantial than it looks. Then the doctors appear, and the morning begins in earnest. Your lead trainer, the doctorus assigned to the group of new arrivals, is a man of perhaps 45 who moves like someone who has been doing this for 20 years, which he has. He is not cruel in any theatrical sense. He is not going to pace around you delivering speeches about glory and weakness and the honor of the sand. He is a professional technician in the business of making human bodies more capable of controlled violence, and he approaches this work with the same energy a good carpenter brings to a complicated joint. Focused, methodical, entirely uninterested in your emotional response to the process. He looks at you and the other new arrivals assembled in your ragged, slightly porridge-dazed line, and he says something in Latin that the more experienced men around the edges translate, either verbally for those who need it or simply by demonstration. The message, in whatever language it arrives, is go to the palus. The palus is a wooden post, a thick one planted solidly in the training floor, roughly the height of a standing man, and it is your primary opponent for what is going to feel like the rest of your natural life. Before you ever practice against another human being, before you come within striking distance of an actual weapon in any meaningful training context, you are going to spend weeks, possibly months, working against this post. You are going to hit it, thrust at it, cut at it, circle around it, maintain guard positions in front of it, and develop a relationship with it that is more intimate and more demanding than most of your human relationships have been. This was not casual Roman pedagogy. The Palu system was deliberate and foundational, and it traced its lineage through Roman military training. The legions used the same method to train their infantry, and the gladiatorial schools borrowed and adapted it for their own purposes. The Roman military writer Vegetius, writing in the 4th century CE, described the Palu's training system in enough detail that historians can reconstruct its basic principles. You learned your strikes in isolation first, developing the muscle patterns correctly before introducing the chaos of a real opponent. You learned where your weight was, how your feet needed to be positioned, how far your striking arm extended without compromising your guard. You learned all of this against something that could not hit you back, which seems merciful until about the 4th hour, when your arms have turned into 2 large pieces of wet rope attached to your shoulders and the wooden post seems to be mocking you with its absolute indifference to your suffering. The weapons you train with at this stage are not real weapons. They are wooden practice weapons, rudis for the sword, wooden substitutes for shields, and they are weighted heavier than their real counterparts. This was another deliberate choice, not a budget constraint. Training with heavier practice weapons meant that when you eventually graduated to actual equipment, it felt lighter and more manageable, which translated directly into speed and endurance in actual combat. The Romans had figured this out empirically centuries before anyone had the conceptual framework of sports science to explain why it worked. You pick up your rudis, wooden, heavy, balanced somewhere between awkward and impossible, and you face the palus, and the doctorus demonstrates the first basic guard position, and you copy it, and he adjusts your elbow with a single precise tap of 2 fingers that somehow communicates volumes about how wrong your elbow was, and you adjust and he moves on to the next person. This is where the modern body problem becomes vivid and somewhat humiliating. You have, almost certainly, spent your adult life operating under a set of physical assumptions that the Roman gladiatorial training system is about to contest aggressively. You sit, probably for large portions of your day, at a desk, in a vehicle, on a couch, and while you may exercise in the modern sense is not the same thing as what a Roman laborer or soldier or gladiatorial trainee's body was built from. The Roman bodies around you in this courtyard represent the product of lives already spent in significant physical labor. The free volunteers who signed the Octoramentum often came from military backgrounds or heavy labor trades. The slaves purchased for gladiatorial training were frequently selected from populations accustomed to agricultural or construction work. Even allowing for the enormous variation in individual fitness, the baseline physical capability of your average Roman entering the ludus was substantially higher than the baseline physical capability of your average modern person entering any comparable training environment. Your grip, specifically, is going to be a problem. The rudis is heavier than you expected, and holding it in the guard position, arm extended, wrist firm, weapon point directed at the center of the palus, is already, after approximately 4 minutes, creating a burning sensation in your forearm that suggests your forearm has opinions about this activity, and those opinions are negative. The men on either side of you are holding their guard positions with what appears to be no particular effort, which is either extremely motivating or profoundly demoralizing depending on how you're choosing to frame the experience. The doctorus returns to you. He observes your trembling guard position with an expression of complete scientific neutrality. He makes a small adjustment to your stance, feet slightly wider, weight shifted marginally back. That inexplicably makes the position somewhat more sustainable, and then he says something short and moves on. The man next to you, who has been here 3 weeks, translates in a whisper. He said your legs work. It is, in context, a compliment. The first training session of the morning lasts approximately 2 hours, broken into segments, guard work, basic strikes against the paulus, footwork patterns, and then a period of something the Romans called armatura, coordinated movement drills that are somewhere between martial training and what a modern observer might recognize as a choreographed routine. The armatura was important partly for its practical training value and partly because the gladiatorial fight, while genuinely dangerous, was also a performance, and a fighter who moved well, who had the physical grammar of combat internalized at the level of instinct, was more valuable than one who merely survived. By the end of the first 2-hour session, you have learned several things about your body that your body apparently did not feel the need to share with you until now. You have learned that your left hip flexor is doing something that merits attention. You have learned that your grip endurance is, relative to what is going to be required of you, approximately 1/3 of adequate. You have learned that the specific combination of movements involved in a basic gladiatorial cut and recover sequence uses muscles in your upper back that you were not previously aware of owning, and that these muscles, now that they have been introduced to you, have a great deal to say. There is a rest period. You sit in whatever shade the courtyard wall provides and drink water. Plain water served in clay cups, adequate in quantity, and you look at your hands. Your palms are already pink and tender from the wooden grip. Around you, the more experienced men use the rest period with the practiced efficiency of people who know exactly how much recovery they can accomplish in the available time. They stretch specific muscle groups, they flex and release their hands. They eat small amounts of the grain-based food that circulates during breaks. Nobody is wasting this time on sitting and staring into the middle distance, which is what you are doing, but nobody comes to tell you to stop because this is your first morning, and even the ludus has a brief policy of orientation grace. The second training session is harder than the first, which surprised you, though in retrospect you're not sure why. The doctorus introduces new elements, the basic principles of distance management, which is the science of staying exactly far enough from an opponent that you can strike without being struck. A concept that sounds simple and is in practice one of the most technically demanding skills in any fighting discipline. You practice this against the paulus, which cannot strike back, but the principle is being laid into your muscle memory regardless. Step in, strike, recover, maintain distance. The paulus stands there receiving your strikes with magnificent patience, because it is a post. One of the senior fighters, a man perhaps 2 years into his time at the ludus, who is working through an advanced sequence on a different post nearby, glances over at you at one point and makes a small, brief adjustment to his form that seems designed to be visible to you, showing you something without making a thing of it, an almost imperceptible act of curriculum. You adjust accordingly, and the sequence clicks into something slightly more coherent, and when you look back he is already focused on his own work again. This, you will later understand, was one of the less documented but clearly real features of the ludus social economy. The informal transmission of knowledge between fighters at different levels of experience. The doctors were the official instructors, but the daily, granular, practical knowledge of how to survive in training and eventually in the arena circulated laterally as well as vertically. Historians still argue whether this informal mentorship system was tolerated or actively encouraged by the ludus administration, but the practical logic seems clear enough. A school that produces better fighters is a more profitable school, and information flowing between students serves that goal. By midday, when the training floor empties for the main meal and the long rest period that follows, the Romans took their midday break seriously, and the ludus was not going to sacrifice its fighters' recovery on the altar of relentless scheduling. You have been awake for perhaps 6 hours and your body is composing what can only be described as a strongly worded letter. Every major muscle group has something to report. Your shoulders are making a case for early retirement. Your legs, which the doctorus acknowledged approvingly, are at least functional but very much aware that they have been used. Your hands are going to need something, oil probably, because the Romans used olive oil for almost every skin-related purpose, and the ludus maintained a supply of it for exactly this kind of first-day damage. You lower yourself onto a bench in the shade, and the midday heat settles over the courtyard, and somewhere in the kitchen the smells of the main meal are building, and you think about the post you spent the morning hitting. You think about the precise, quiet correction of the doctorus's 2 fingers on your elbow. You think about the small demonstration from the senior fighter nearby, the generosity of it, the economy of it. You are not good at this yet. You are not even close to good. You are at the very bottom of a very long staircase, and every step is going to cost something, and the stairs do not care about your prior life or your modern sensibilities or the fact that your forearms have filed a formal complaint. But you hit the post this morning. You held the guard position until you couldn't, and then you held it a little longer. And the doctoress said your legs work. In the logic of the ludus, in the grammar of this place, that is day one. That is where everyone starts. The afternoon is coming. And the afternoon, someone nearby mentions with the cheerful cruelty of the experienced, is longer than the morning. The afternoon session ends with the light going amber and long across the training floor, and you learn something important in those last 40 minutes that no one explicitly teaches you. The hierarchy of this place is not posted on a wall or explained in an orientation document. It is written entirely in bodies, in who stands where, who defers to whom, who gets the better post position, who eats first, who speaks and who listens, and whose silence in a given moment carries more weight than anyone else's words. You read it the way you'd read a language you don't technically speak but have enough context to partially decode. And what you read is this: the ludus has a social architecture as intricate and load-bearing as the stone walls around it, and understanding it is not optional. It is survival of a different kind. At the top of the hierarchy, above even the lanista in terms of daily, lived authority over your existence, sits the doctoress. Not a single person, there are several, each specializing in different weapons and fighting styles, but the class of them together, their collective judgment, represents the organizing intelligence of everything that happens on the training floor. The doctors were, in most cases, former gladiators themselves. Men who had survived long enough, fought well enough, and accumulated enough technical knowledge to transition from fighter to instructor, a career move that came with a significant upgrade in life expectancy and a completely different set of daily problems. Their authority was absolute within their domain, and their domain was the training floor, which is to say their authority covered most of your waking existence. Below the doctors but above you in a distance you cannot currently accurately measure sits the layered world of the existing fighters, and this is where things get genuinely interesting because the ranking system inside the ludus was not simply about seniority or physical capability, though both of those things mattered. It was about a combination of factors: experience, fighting record, specialized training, and crucially, the specific fighting style you had been assigned or were developing toward, and those factors interlocked in ways that created a social map of considerable complexity. The fighting styles themselves were the foundational categories. Roman gladiatorial combat was not a single discipline practiced by interchangeable fighters. It was a collection of highly specialized roles, each with its own equipment, its own techniques, its own strengths and vulnerabilities, and its own set of traditional opponents. The system had evolved over several centuries from its origins, which historians trace to funeral games in Etruscan and early Roman culture, though the precise lineage is debated, into something remarkably codified by the imperial period. There were perhaps a dozen distinct types of gladiator that appear consistently in the historical record, though the exact number and their precise definitions shifted across time and region, which is one of the things that keeps classical scholars happily arguing at conferences. The most recognizable, at least to modern eyes, is probably the murmillo, a heavily armored fighter carrying a large rectangular shield called a scutum and a short stabbing sword called a gladius, wearing a distinctive helmet with a high crest and full face guard. The murmillo was in many ways the foot soldier of the gladiatorial world, drawing on the equipment and fighting principles of the Roman legionary tradition, which gave him a certain symbolic resonance in the Roman imagination. He was strength and discipline made physical, the martial virtues of Rome rendered into a fighting body. He was also, by the standards of arena combat, quite slow, and the armor that protected him so comprehensively also made him work extremely hard in the Italian heat, which was its own form of attrition. The secutor was a close relative of the murmillo, similarly armored but with a smoother, more streamlined helmet. A design choice that was not aesthetic but functional, because the secutor's traditional opponent was the retiarius, the net fighter, and the retiarius's primary weapon aside from his trident was the net itself, which could catch on crests and facial guards and give him the leverage to yank an opponent off balance. The secutor's smooth helmet was specifically engineered to resist exactly this, which means that at some point in the development of this combat system, someone thought carefully enough about the mechanics of being caught in a net to redesign their headgear in response. Romans, again, practical to a degree that stops being reassuring and starts being slightly alarming. The Retiarius himself occupied a fascinating social position within the gladiatorial hierarchy. He was almost unique among fighter types in that he wore no helmet and very little armor, a shoulder guard on one arm, a bracer on the other, essentially nothing protecting his head and face. This made him simultaneously the most visually exposed fighter in the arena and, arguably, the most mobile. His fighting style relied on reach, the net to entangle, the trident to keep distance and strike, a dagger for close work, and on movement, circling and repositioning rather than the controlled, grinding forward pressure of the heavily armored styles. He was also, for reasons that tell you a great deal about Roman attitudes toward masculinity and combat, considered by Roman audiences to be somewhat less honorable than his more heavily armored counterparts. The exposed face was part of it. Romans associated the gladiatorial helmet with dignity in combat, and fighting without one carried a social valence that the Retiarius apparently had to manage carefully. There is evidence from graffiti and literary sources that the Retiarius was sometimes mocked. His fighting style considered unmanly by the standards of a culture that found heavily armored men stabbing each other with short swords to be the pinnacle of dignified expression. Across the training floor from where you stood this morning, you can now identify with your newly developing eye the different groups training together according to style. The heavily armored fighters work through their sequences with the weight and deliberate economy of their equipment. Elsewhere, a small group practicing Retiarius techniques moves with a completely different rhythm, open, flowing, the practice net being cast and recovered with a wrist motion that looks simple and demonstrably isn't, because the man next to the instructor is casting his practice net with all the grace of someone trying to throw a fishing net in a hurricane, and the instructor is watching him with an expression that suggests this particular session is going to continue until something improves. You do not yet know which category you're being assessed for. That assessment is ongoing, conducted by the doctors through the act of watching you move, watching how you hold the rudis, watching your footwork and your guard, and the instinctive decisions you make in the half-second gaps between drills. It is not a test with a clear beginning and end. It is a continuous observation that has been running since you walked through the gates, and the conclusion, your assigned style, the fighting identity you are going to spend months or years developing, will be delivered to you when the doctors have reached it, not before. In the meantime, you navigate the courtyard with the careful social awareness that the afternoon has impressed upon you. There are men here who have been training for a year, 2 years, longer. There are men who have already fought in the arena, who carry that experience in their bodies and their eyes in a way that is not easily described but is immediately legible. And there are men who have fought and won significant victories, whose names you will come to recognize because those names are spoken by others with a specific weight that functions as its own form of currency. The veterans of the ludus, the men with arena experience, with records, with reputations, occupied a position that had material as well as social dimensions. Better sleeping quarters, or at least better placement within shared quarters. Better food, or at least better supplementation of the standard diet. More latitude in daily schedule, more freedom of movement within the facility, more access to the medical staff on their own terms rather than on a triage basis. These privileges were not formally codified in most ludi, but they were real, and they functioned as the carrot in a system whose stick was already fairly obvious. There was also the question of chains. This is the part that the movies sometimes show and sometimes don't, and when they do show it, they usually get the tone slightly wrong. The chaining of gladiators, specifically new arrivals and those considered flight risks or behavioral problems, was real, documented in legal sources and mentioned in literary accounts, but it was not universal and it was not permanent for those who demonstrated compliance and commitment to the training regimen. The chain was a tool of institutional control applied to a specific category of risk, and its removal was a status marker that mattered. A man unchained was a man the ludus had decided to invest trust in, not unlimited trust, not freedom in any meaningful sense, but the institutional acknowledgement that this particular person had internalized enough of the ludus's logic to be allowed to move through the facility without the additional constraint. Sounds like a small thing. In context, it was not a small thing at all. It was the first step in a progression that, for the most successful fighters, eventually led to something that looked almost like autonomy. The man you mentally designated on your first night as the one with information, the one sitting against the wall with arms folded and unreadable expression, turns out to be named, within the ludus, Corvus. dark-haired, medium height, with the specific kind of stillness that comes from having made a comprehensive internal peace with his circumstances. He has been at this ludus for 14 months and is somewhere in the progression between new arrival and established fighter. He speaks enough of your language, or enough of a shared third language that both of you approximate, to function as an informal interpreter in the gaps between official instruction, and he has apparently decided that orienting a new arrival is a reasonable use of some of his time, though he does this without any ceremony or explanation of his own motivations. Corvus explains the eating order at the evening meal, who serves first, where you sit relative to the established fighters, the specific protocol around the senior trainer's table that you should not violate under any circumstances, which you appreciate knowing in advance. He explains which of the doctors is strict in ways that are predictable and therefore navigable, and which is strict in ways that are arbitrary and therefore requires a different kind of attention. He explains, with the economy of someone who has already processed his own version of this information and distilled it to its essentials, that the fastest way to make your life inside the ludus worse than it needs to be is to confuse visibility with status. Being seen is not the same as being recognized. A new arrival who makes himself conspicuous, who pushes too early for attention, who mistakes enthusiasm for capability, who challenges the established order of the training floor before he has anything to back it up with, creates problems for himself that take a long time to resolve. This is wisdom delivered without warmth but also without cruelty, and you receive it in the spirit in which it is offered. Corvus then goes back to his own preparation for the evening meal and does not look at you again in a way that suggests the tutorial portion of your relationship has concluded, at least for today. The evening meal is the main meal of the day, more substantial than the morning porridge, involving cooked grains and legumes, some olive oil, sometimes dried fruit or cheese in small amounts. Occasionally meat, though less frequently than you might expect given the protein requirements of serious athletic training. The Romans supplemented the gladiatorial diet in ways the Ephesus bone analysis has given us some window into, including what appears to have been a calcium supplement of some kind, possibly a drink made with plant ash, which the isotopic evidence suggests was consumed in significant quantities and which kept the skeletal density of the fighters high despite the physical punishment of training. Historians still argue over the exact composition and purpose of these supplements, but the bone evidence is fairly unambiguous about the result. Gladiators had very dense, well-mineralized bones, which is either testament to excellent nutritional management or the Roman equivalent of someone at a wellness counter telling you to take your calcium, just with considerably more institutional enforcement. You eat. The food is plain and plentiful, and after a morning and afternoon of training, plain and plentiful is exactly what your body wants, and you eat more than you expected to, because it turns out that sustained physical effort has opinions about portion sizes that your sedentary life had not previously introduced you to. After the meal there is a period that functions as the ludus equivalent of evening, not free time in any modern recreational sense, but a reduction in the intensity of institutional demand that creates space for the small human activities that keep a population of confined, physically stressed people psychologically functional. Men repair their equipment, or more accurately repair the practice equipment they are permitted to maintain themselves, with the focused attention of people who understand that their tools are their survival. Some men talk. Some men are quiet. There are board games. The Romans loved board games with a passion that deserves more cultural recognition, and several versions of games that function somewhat like backgammon appear across Roman sites. And there is no reason to think the ludus was exempt from this, and the click and rattle of pieces on a wooden board provides a domestic counterpoint to the day's wait. There were also, in the evenings, the letters. Men who were literate wrote, or dictated to those who were more so, letters to family members outside the walls. Wives, parents, siblings, children, the social bonds that the ludus could constrain physically but could not entirely sever. Evidence from inscriptions and papyri across the Roman world suggests that gladiators maintained family connections throughout their careers, sometimes remarkably richly. There are funerary inscriptions erected by gladiators' wives, recording grief and partnership in language that is specific and personal rather than formulaic. There are inscriptions erected by the gladiators themselves, or by fellow fighters acting as chosen family, that speak of friendship and brotherhood in terms that complicate the standard narrative of the ludus as a place of atomized, isolated fighters. The institution tried to make you into a specific kind of person, a fighter, a professional, a component of the Roman entertainment economy, and it largely succeeded because it had centuries of institutional knowledge and significant practical leverage on its side. But the person it made you into was still a person, with the full human inventory of connection and memory and the need to be known by someone. The evening, with its small sounds of conversation and the scratch of a stylus and the click of game pieces, was where that inventory got maintained against the day's best efforts to reduce you to your function. You find a spot against the courtyard wall, in the warm residue of the day's heat still radiating from the stone, and you sit, and you take stock of what you've accumulated in roughly 16 waking hours. A new name, delivered to you this afternoon by the doctoress with no more ceremony than a tool being labeled. A clear picture of your physical inadequacies, which is at least useful information even when it is uncomfortable information. A basic orientation to the social geography of this place, courtesy of Corvus and your own observation. And a beginning, a genuine beginning, however humble, of the physical language that this place speaks. The stars are coming out above the courtyard walls. Roman stars, the same stars, looking down on Capua with complete indifference to the drama being conducted beneath them. You think about the men around you, and the men who came before them in this same space, and the men who will come after you, each one arriving at this same first evening with this same first calculus of survival. The bell will ring again before first light, and tomorrow the arithmetic gets harder. The weeks begin to stack. You don't notice the first week passing so much as you notice that your hands have stopped hurting in the same way. The raw tenderness of day one has been replaced by something harder, drier, the skin thickening over the palms and the insides of the fingers in a way that is unglamorous but functional, the body's quiet editorial response to repeated information. Your shoulders have stopped filing formal complaints and started simply accepting their situation with the grim pragmatism of long-term residents. You are not yet good. You are still a long way from good. But you are beginning to be shaped by this place in ways that are visible if you know where to look, and the doctors who know exactly where to look have started looking at you differently. Not warmly, not with approval exactly. With a kind of recalibrating assessment that suggests the initial data they collected on you is being revised upward, slightly, in specific categories. The body is the first and most obvious site of transformation, and it happens faster than you expected and more strangely than you expected, because it doesn't happen the way modern fitness culture has led you to believe it happens. There are no dramatic before and after moments, no sudden revelations of capability. There is just the slow, daily accumulation of adaptation, muscles that rebuild overnight fractionally stronger than they were the day before, neural pathways that begin to carry the signals for specific movement patterns with increasing efficiency. The whole biological system quietly reorganizing itself around the demands being placed on it. You wake up one morning and realize that the guard position you could barely hold for 4 minutes on day 1 you can now sustain for 20, and you don't remember the individual days between those 2 data points because they were all, on the surface, the same day. What you do remember with specific clarity is the medical staff. The Ludus maintained a medical facility, and this is one of the aspects of the gladiatorial institution that genuinely surprises modern expectations, because most people's mental model of ancient Roman healthcare is somewhere between primitive and non-existent. The reality, at least within the organized Ludi of the imperial period, was considerably more sophisticated than that mental model allows. The doctors who worked in the major gladiatorial schools were not the equivalent of a first aid station. They were trained physicians operating within the most advanced medical tradition available in the ancient world, and there is specific, documented evidence that at least some of them were very good at their jobs. The most famous of these is a man named Galen, who would go on to become the most influential physician in the Western world for the next 14 centuries, whose anatomical and medical theories would shape European medicine from his own lifetime in the 2nd century CE all the way through the Renaissance. Before all of that, before the imperial court appointments and the voluminous writings that would define medical thought for a millennium and a half, Galen was the physician at the gladiatorial school in Pergamon, a major city in what is now Western Turkey, for several years in the 150s and 160s CE. He was young, ambitious, and operating in an environment that gave him something no other medical context of his era could provide. A steady, large, diverse population of physically elite individuals experiencing a constant and documented variety of traumatic injuries under controlled conditions. Galen later wrote that his time at the gladiatorial school taught him more about the human body than any other experience in his career. The wounds, the cuts, the blunt trauma, the joint injuries, the occasional more severe damage were, in his own words, windows into the body. He could observe what happened when specific structures were damaged and what interventions produced the best outcomes, and he could observe this repeatedly across multiple individuals and draw comparative conclusions. He was, in effect, running an involuntary longitudinal study on human trauma medicine, and the results went into his writing and from his writing into the bloodstream of Western medical thought. The Ludus's investment in quality medical care was, as with most things in this institution, primarily economic rather than humanitarian. A gladiator who died from an infected wound because no one cleaned it properly was a financial loss. A gladiator who recovered from a significant injury and returned to the training floor was a financial recovery. The incentive to keep fighters alive and functional was built into the economic structure of the enterprise, and it produced, as an almost incidental byproduct, some of the most advanced trauma medicine practiced anywhere in the ancient world. Your first encounter with the medical facilities comes about 3 weeks in, when a training exercise goes slightly wrong and you take a wooden rudis across the upper forearm in a way that the doctoress immediately identifies as requiring attention. It is not serious, a deep bruise, possibly a very minor fracture of one of the smaller bones, the kind of injury that in modern terms would earn you an X-ray and an ice pack and some ibuprofen, but you are taken to the medical room, which smells of the herbs and olive oil and something sharp and resinous that you eventually identify as a wine-based antiseptic preparation, and a physician's assistant examines the arm with practiced hands, makes a determination, applies a poultice of what appears to be herbs and animal fat, bandages it firmly, and tells you, through a translator, to rest the arm for 2 days and then return for reassessment. The poultice is not nothing. Archaeological and textual evidence from Roman medical practice includes a substantial pharmacopoeia of topical treatments. Preparations involving plantain, honey, sulfur compounds, various resins, that modern analysis has in many cases confirmed have genuine antimicrobial or anti-inflammatory properties. The Romans didn't know why these things worked in the mechanistic sense that modern pharmacology understands, but they had centuries of empirical data about what produced better outcomes. And the gladiatorial medical tradition represented the concentrated application of that data to a population where outcomes were very carefully tracked. You sit in the medical room for a while, your arm freshly bandaged, and you look around at the evidence of organized care. The shelves of ceramic jars, the rolls of linen bandage, the bronze instruments whose purposes you can mostly guess and occasionally would rather not. This room has seen worse than your forearm. Much worse. The surgical capabilities of Roman military and gladiatorial medicine included wound closure, fracture management, and in some cases procedures that would be recognizable to a modern surgeon. Not identical, not equivalent, but recognizable in their underlying logic. Historians still argue about the survival rates for various categories of gladiatorial injury, but the skeletal evidence from sites like Ephesus suggests that men survived and healed from injuries that, without organized medical intervention, would have been fatal or permanently disabling. 2 days of rest. You used them. This is another adjustment that your modern sensibility has to make in the context of Ludus life. The concept of rest here is not the same as the concept of rest you brought with you. Rest in the Ludus is not leisure. It is recovery, a specific, purposeful physiological state that the institution understands as part of the training cycle rather than an interruption of it. During your 2 days of arm rest, you still rise with the bell. You still eat at the prescribed times. You still observe the morning training session, watching from the edge of the courtyard with the attentiveness of someone who has been told that watching counts, because the doctors have told you it counts. And they are correct. The observation of correct form in others is a form of learning that the motor system processes and retains, particularly when the observer is already partially trained. You are building something in your head while your arm heals, and when you return to the Paulus on day 3, the first few minutes confirm that the building happened. The rhythm of the Ludus day is, once you are inside it, a surprisingly sophisticated program. Not sophisticated in an intentional sports science sense, the Romans didn't have that conceptual framework, but sophisticated in the empirical sense, worked out over generations of institutional trial and error into something that produced reliably good results. The morning session was the primary technical training period, cooler and lower intensity, focused on skill development. Midday was rest and the main meal, the body given time and fuel for recovery. The afternoon session varied, sometimes a continuation of technical work, sometimes more physically intense conditioning, sometimes sparring against partners rather than the palus. Evening was the wind down, the social time, the maintenance. Within this rhythm, the diet continued to be the element that most consistently surprised you. The barleymen reputation was well-earned, grain and legumes remained the foundation, but the Ludus diet was more varied than that simple characterization suggests. Olive oil appeared at almost every meal in some form, providing caloric density and the fats that sustained the physical demands of daily training. Dried fruit and honey provided fast energy at specific points in the day. Eggs appeared occasionally. The meat question was complicated. Roman dietary practice varied significantly by region, season, and economic context, and the gladiatorial diet seems to have included animal protein in amounts that were lower than you'd expect for elite athletes but not entirely absent. There was also the wine. Not in the quantities that Roman drinking culture might suggest to a modern imagination, and not at the times that would compromise training performance. But wine, diluted with water in the standard Roman fashion, was part of the daily provision. The dilution was significant. The ratio of water to wine in everyday Roman consumption was typically high enough that the resulting beverage was closer to a lightly flavored, mildly alcoholic drink than to wine as modern people experience it. The alcohol content was low enough that it functioned more as a safe drinking water alternative, important in a world where untreated water carried real pathogenic risk, than as an intoxicant. The Ludus was not running a bar. It was maintaining hydration in an era before municipal water treatment. Supplements, as the Ephesus research suggests, came in the form of mineral-rich preparations that the fighters consumed regularly. The bone evidence points to calcium intake significantly above what the diet alone would explain, and the most likely explanation is the ash-based drink, a preparation made from the ash of burned plant material mixed into liquid that would have delivered substantial amounts of calcium and other minerals. This was not folk medicine in the casual sense. This was institutionally administered nutritional management, and the skeletal evidence suggests it worked. Gladiatorial bones from the Ephesus cemetery show mineralization levels that compare favorably to what modern sports science would consider optimal for high-impact athletic performance. Quirky as it sounds, the gladiator was, by the nutritional standards of his time, one of the best-fed and most medically attended individuals in Roman society. This is one of those historical ironies that takes a moment to fully land. A person who had in many cases been enslaved, stripped of their name and previous identity, confined behind high walls and trained in the business of potentially lethal public performance, was also receiving better health care and more consistent nutritional provision than the majority of free Roman citizens. The Roman underclass, the urban poor who scraped by on the grain dole and whatever work they could find, would have looked at the Ludus diet and its medical facilities with a complicated mixture of horror and envy, which is exactly the kind of uncomfortable historical contradiction that keeps scholars returning to the subject. Your arm heals cleanly. The physician's assistant examines it on the third day and pronounces it functional, which it is, and you return to the palus with the small but real confidence of someone who has encountered the institution's medical apparatus and found it, within its limits, competent. This is not nothing. In a world where infection killed more people than most weapons, working in a facility with a serious medical staff was a genuine survival advantage. The weeks continue. Your body continues its quiet reorganization. You eat your barley and your legumes and your olive oil, and you drink your diluted wine and your mysterious calcium preparation, and you sleep on your straw mat with the exhausted completeness of a body that has spent everything it had and knows that tomorrow it will be asked to spend it again. The other new arrivals are sorting themselves out around you. Some are progressing quickly, their bodies adapting with a speed that suggests prior physical conditioning. The ones who came from military backgrounds or heavy labor trades, just as you'd have predicted. Some are struggling in ways that are quieter than yours but deeper, the struggle not of physical inadequacy but of psychological resistance, the difficulty of surrendering to the total logic of the institution. The Ludus could handle physical weakness. That was, in fact, what it was designed to address. What it found harder to work with was a person whose mind kept trying to negotiate, kept reaching for the self it had been before the gates closed. Corvus, who has continued his spare, unsentimental orientation of you when the opportunity arises, puts this plainly one evening while you are both sitting against the warm courtyard wall watching a pair of fighters run through a sparring sequence in the fading light. He says, in the approximate shared language you've developed between you, that the ones who fight the place, not in the arena but in here, in their heads, every day fighting the fact of where they are, those ones use up something that they need for the training. They spend their energy on the wrong opponent. You watch the sparring fighters, the controlled, precise exchange of forms, the Doctorus observing from the side with his arms folded, and you think about what Corvus said, and you think about the energy you've spent in the last several weeks, and you take an honest accounting of how much of it went to the Paulus and how much of it went to the internal argument about whether this was really happening. The internal argument is losing, not because you've surrendered anything essential, not because the institution has successfully replaced you with its preferred version of you, but because the body is pragmatic in a way that the mind eventually has to follow. The body is here. The body is adapting. The body has opinions about what needs to happen tomorrow morning, and those opinions are specific and practical and entirely grounded in the reality of the training floor. You flex your healed forearm. You open and close your calloused hand. You look at the Paulus standing in its familiar position across the courtyard, patient and indifferent, waiting for tomorrow. Tomorrow, the Doctorus has indicated, through the specific economy of gesture and Latin that you've been steadily decoding, that your style assignment is coming. The assessment period is ending. You are about to find out what kind of fighter this place has decided you are going to become, which is a sentence that contains multitudes and which you are too tired to fully process tonight. The evening smells like olive oil and warm stone and the lingering herbal edge of the medical room. Somewhere in the kitchen, someone is preparing tomorrow's porridge with the resigned competence of a person who has made this porridge many times and expects to make it many more. The stars appear above the walls. You close your eyes. Your body is already preparing for the bell. The style assignment arrives not with ceremony but with a gesture. The senior Doctorus catching your eye across the training floor in the early morning light and inclining his head toward a specific group of men working in the far corner of the courtyard. You look at the group, then back at him, and he has already looked away because the communication is complete and he has other things to do. You walk across the courtyard toward your new cohort with the careful neutrality of someone who is not sure yet whether what just happened is good news or complicated news, and the answer, as it turns out, is both simultaneously, which is very on-brand for this place. The group you've been assigned to is training in the Secutor style, and this information lands with a particular weight once Corvus explains its implications during the midday break. Because the Secutor, the pursuer, the name drawn from the Latin verb to follow or to chase, is defined as much by his opponent as by his own equipment. The Secutor exists in direct relational counterpoint to the Retiarius, the net fighter, and everything about the Secutor's design is a response to the specific threat that the Retiarius presents. The smooth helmet, as you already know, the heavy scutum shield, the gladius at the hip. The training you are about to discover reflects this opponent-specific logic in ways that are going to demand a complete rethinking of how you've been using your body for the past several weeks. Fighting with a net against you changes everything about distance management. The Retiarius wants range. He wants to be far enough away to cast the net effectively, close enough that the trident can reach you once the net has done its work. The Secutor's job is to collapse that distance, to get inside the net's effective range before it can be deployed, while simultaneously protecting against the trident and the dagger and the Retiarius's considerable advantage in mobility. Where the training you've done so far has been about learning the grammar of combat in its most foundational form, guard, strike, recover, distance, the Secutor training is about learning a very specific tactical sentence. And that sentence has to be delivered under conditions designed to make it as difficult as possible to speak. Your new Doctorus for weapons training is a compact, olive-skinned man who goes by the training floor name of Strabo, which means squinter, a nickname earned either from an actual visual condition or from the way he watches fighters through narrowed eyes with an attention so focused it looks like concentration pain. Strabo doesn't waste words. In the first session with your new cohort, he demonstrates the fundamental Secutor advance, a controlled, shield-forward approach that presents the smallest possible target to the net while maintaining enough lateral mobility to react to the cast. And then he watches each of you attempt it with an expression that suggests he has seen this particular sequence of mistakes many times before and has developed a comprehensive taxonomy of them. Your mistakes are, according to Strabo's adjustments, primarily in the shield arm. You are carrying the scutum too low. which protects your body adequately but leaves your helmet's face opening vulnerable to the trident, and you are carrying it too far from your body, which creates leverage problems that will exhaust your arm faster than the Secutor's already demanding equipment load requires. The scutum is not a light object. The Roman military-style rectangular shield was typically constructed from layered plywood, sheets of wood glued with the grain running in alternating directions, the same engineering principle as modern plywood, because the Romans figured this out 2 millennia before anyone else thought to call it that. Covered in leather and canvas and fitted with a central iron boss. Combat weight estimates for the scutum vary in the scholarly literature, but the consensus sits somewhere around 5 to 10 kilograms, which doesn't sound catastrophic until you've been holding it at arm's length for 2 hours in the Italian afternoon heat and your left shoulder has filed the same complaint your forearm filed during week 1, with equivalent sincerity. Strabo repositions your shield arm twice in the first session and says something to the man next to you that produces a short laugh, the first laugh you've heard from a doctorus, even a redirected one, and the man translates. He says you hold the scutum like you're offering bread to a nervous horse. You adjust your grip. The adjustment is immediately, humiliatingly, better. The weapons themselves, now that you are training with closer approximations of the real equipment, deserve their own attention, because they are the most technically sophisticated objects you have encountered in your time here, and they represent a level of craft that should probably recalibrate your assumptions about ancient manufacturing. The gladius, the short Roman sword that was the primary weapon of several fighting styles including the secutor, was not a crude instrument. It was a precisely engineered cutting and stabbing tool, typically between 60 and 85 centimeters in total length, with a blade profile optimized for the close quarters, shield-to-shield fighting that Roman military and gladiatorial combat both demanded. The short blade was not a compromise or a limitation. It was a design choice, a blade long enough to reach a vital area past a shield, short enough to be controlled in tight spaces, with enough weight and geometry in the tip to deliver effective thrusting force. The metallurgy behind the best Roman blades was, by the standards of the ancient world, sophisticated. Roman smiths understood, empirically if not chemically, how to produce iron with varying carbon content, what we would now call steel, and how to distribute that material through the blade to create an edge that was hard enough to hold a cutting surface while the body of the blade remained flexible enough not to shatter under lateral stress. Historians still argue about the precise methods used in the best Roman sword production, because the ancient sources are frustratingly vague on technical metallurgical detail, preferring to tell you that the blade was excellent rather than why it was excellent. But experimental archaeology, the practice of trying to replicate ancient objects using ancient methods, has produced results suggesting that the best Roman blades were genuinely impressive by any era's standards. You train with a rudis that is weighted to approximate the gladius, and then, in a session that marks a significant threshold, you train for the first time with the real thing. Or rather, with a blunted training gladius, its edge deliberately dulled and its point rounded, but made of actual iron and carrying the actual weight and balance of the weapon you will eventually use in earnest. The difference between the wooden rudis and the iron training blade is not enormous in weight, but it is enormous in feel. The metal carries itself differently, transmits force differently through your hand and wrist, and has a presence that the wood simply doesn't. Holding it changes something in the quality of attention you bring to the exercise, and the doctorus notices this change and approves of it, in the specific way he approves of things, which is by not correcting it. The training for the secutor involves, beyond the basic weapons work, a significant amount of what you can only describe as stamina conditioning specific to the role. The secutor's great tactical problem is that he is chasing a more mobile opponent while wearing more weight, and in the arena's heat that equation trends against him as time passes. The retiarius, lighter and more mobile, wants a long fight. The secutor wants a short one. Everything about secutor training is therefore oriented toward the efficient expenditure of effort, not endurance in the distance-running sense, but the specific kind of explosive, controlled stamina that allows you to make hard, fast moves and recover quickly enough to make the next one. Strabo runs your cohort through interval work that has no formal name in Roman terminology but would be immediately recognizable to a modern athletic coach. Hard effort for a short defined period, rest, hard effort again, rest. The cycle repeated until the body has adapted to operating effectively at the edge of its capacity. You sprint across the training floor carrying the scutum and pull up hard into a guard position and hold it for a count, and then you do it again and then again. And at some point during the third week of this training, your body makes an adaptation that you notice the way you notice a gear shifting. Something that was costing a certain amount now costs slightly less, and the recovered energy is available for the next repetition. Your sparring begins around this time. Not against a Retiarius. That comes later, when both fighters are developed enough to make the exchange genuinely instructive rather than dangerous in unproductive ways. But against other secutors, the mirror match that allows you to practice the guard and advance and weapon work in a dynamic context without the additional variable of a stylistically alien opponent. Your first sparring partner is a man 3 months ahead of you in training, which means he is better than you in every dimension that matters, and the first session is therefore primarily educational in the sense that a demonstration is educational. You learn a great deal about what you don't yet know, communicated through the medium of being outmaneuvered repeatedly by someone who is being genuinely careful not to hurt you while doing so. This care is worth noting. The sparring culture inside the Ludus, at least at the training level, was not about damage. The doctors were extremely clear on this point, and the institutional logic behind their clarity was economic as always. Injuring a training partner in a sparring session was injuring an investment, and the investment was the institution's, not yours. Training injuries happen regardless because training for combat involves contact and contact involves risk, but they were treated as problems to be minimized rather than accepted costs. The fighter who regularly hurt his sparring partners was a liability, and the social pressure within the cohort reinforced this in ways that went beyond official instruction. There is also a technical argument for controlled sparring that the best doctors understood intuitively. The purpose of sparring and training is to learn, and learning is inhibited when the stakes are high enough to activate pure survival response. A fighter in genuine fear for his safety falls back on instinct and stops processing new information, which means the session teaches him nothing he didn't already know. The controlled environment, blunted weapons, experienced oversight, and understood social contract about force levels allowed learning to happen in the gap between comfortable and genuinely threatening, and that gap, the Romans had figured out empirically, was where the useful adaptation occurred. Your second sparring partner is a man your own level, which produces a completely different dynamic. The session is messier, more uncertain, less technically pure, but it has something the one-sided sessions with the more experienced fighter didn't: genuine mutual uncertainty, the situation where neither of you knows exactly what the other is going to do, and that uncertainty is the closest approximation of actual combat conditions that training can produce. You make mistakes that are your own mistakes, not the predictable mistakes of a novice against an expert, but the specific individual mistakes that reveal your particular tendencies, the instincts your body reaches for under pressure when conscious technique starts to slip. Strabo watches your level-matched sparring with the focused attention of a diagnostician. He doesn't intervene frequently. The mistakes you're making at this stage are teaching you things that his intervention would interrupt. But when he does speak, it is to identify a pattern, something you've done 2 or 3 times in a row without noticing. The body's default response to a specific situation that is going to be a predictable vulnerability once an experienced opponent reads it. You are building habits, and habits in combat are either assets or liabilities, and distinguishing between them requires someone watching from outside the loop. The gladius sits differently in your hand by now than it did 3 weeks ago. The grip has settled into something more natural, the wrist angle has corrected itself through repetition, and the basic cut and recover sequence that was conscious effort in week 1 is beginning to move below the surface of deliberate thought. This is the threshold that serious fighters describe and that the doctors watch for, the point at which technique stops being a set of instructions you are following and starts being a language your body speaks without translation. You are not fluent yet, not remotely, but you have begun, and the beginning has a different quality from anything that came before it. The Roman gladiatorial combat system was, at its core, a performance as much as it was a fight, and this duality ran through the training in ways that are easy to miss if you focus only on the martial dimension. The gladiator was an athlete and a craftsman and also, unavoidably, an entertainer, and the Ludus trained all 3 simultaneously. Footwork that was tactically sound was also visually readable to a crowd. Strikes that were biomechanically efficient also looked powerful from the stands. The armatura drills, the coordinated movement sequences, had a theatrical dimension that the fighters internalized along with the martial one. You were learning to fight in a space defined by an audience, and the audience's comprehension of what they were seeing was part of the performance contract. This is one of the aspects of gladiatorial combat that most clearly separates it from modern martial arts or military training, and it produces some genuinely interesting technical questions that scholars have spent considerable effort investigating. The evidence from arena reliefs and mosaics. The visual record of gladiatorial combat, preserved in stone and tile across the Roman world, shows fighters in poses that are sometimes tactically awkward but visually dramatic, and the question of whether this visual record reflects actual fighting practice or artistic convention is one that historians have not fully resolved. The most careful recent analysis suggests the answer is somewhere in between. The visual conventions had some basis in actual practice, but the artistic tradition also amplified and formalized certain elements for effect. You think about this during a late afternoon session when Strabo corrects your advance not for its tactical effectiveness but for its visual clarity. You are telegraphing the move before you execute it, and in the arena a telegraph move is both a tactical problem and an aesthetic one, because a crowd that can read the attack before it lands is a crowd that has been denied the pleasure of surprise, and a crowd denied pleasure is a crowd that remembers the fighter who bored them. The evening finds you again on the warm stone, hands wrapped loosely, the specific tiredness of skilled effort rather than mere endurance settling into your muscles. Corvus sits nearby, working oil into a piece of leather equipment with patient circular strokes, and without looking up he mentions, in his spare, considered way, that Strabo told the senior doctorus this afternoon that you are beginning to understand the scutum. Beginning to understand the scutum. Not mastered, not good. Beginning to understand. In the economy of this place, where praise is rationed with the precision of a military quartermaster, this information arrives with the weight of a standing ovation. You look at your hands. You think about the wooden paulus you hit for weeks before any of this. You think about the gesture from the senior doctorus across the training floor this morning, the barely perceptible inclination of the head that changed the entire shape of what you are becoming. The gladius is at your hip, the blunted training version, returned to you for individual practice outside formal sessions now that the threshold of basic competence has been crossed. You put your hand on the hilt, not drawing it, just resting there, feeling the familiar weight of the thing. Outside the walls, Capua is going about its evening. People are eating, talking, conducting the ordinary business of lives that do not involve learning to fight in front of tens of thousands of people. You think about those lives for a moment, their texture, their ordinariness, the absence of the paulus and the bell, and the smell of iron and olive oil and herbal preparation that now forms the permanent sensory backdrop of your existence. Then you stop thinking about those lives because Strabo has scheduled an early start tomorrow and your body has opinions about sleep that are becoming increasingly difficult to negotiate with. You are a secutor, or the beginning of one. The net is coming, and you need to be ready. The net arrives on a Tuesday, or what would be a Tuesday if the Romans organized their week the way you do, which they didn't. The Roman calendar ran on an 8-day market cycle called the Nundinal cycle with days labeled A through H, and the 7-day week as a cultural institution was still working its way into Roman consciousness during the imperial period, imported from Eastern Mediterranean traditions and not yet dominant. This is the kind of detail that the ludus does not care about in the slightest because the ludus runs on the bell and the training schedule and the slow rotation of the Roman Games calendar, not on what day of any particular week it happens to be. The net arrives when Strabo decides it arrives, which is a morning about 6 weeks into your secutor training, when he appears at the edge of the training floor accompanied by a fighter you haven't worked with before. Lean, watchful, moving with the specific unhurried fluidity of someone who has made peace with being the most mobile person in any room, and drops a folded practice net onto the sand between you. The retiarius across from you goes by Aquila in the arena, though that name will come later. In training, he is simply called by a shortened version of something in his birth language that the Roman administrative apparatus rendered phonetically and imperfectly in its records. He has been at the ludus for 2 years. He has 3 arena appearances to his record, all of which he survived, which is not a sentence you can say about everyone in this facility. He looks at you with the professional curiosity of a craftsman examining a new material, and the assessment in his eyes is not hostile, but it is not warm either. It is the evaluation of someone who is about to spend the next several months making you better by making your life very specifically difficult. The net itself, the practice version, weighted and proportioned correctly but made without the lead weights that arm the combat version at its edges, is a remarkable object once you look at it closely. It is circular, roughly 3 meters in diameter when spread, woven from cord in a pattern designed to catch and hold without cutting, with a drawstring mechanism around the perimeter that allowed the retiarius to retrieve it after a cast by pulling the cord. The cast, the fundamental offensive action of the retiarius style, was a learned skill of considerable technical complexity, and watching Aquila demonstrate it for Strabo's benefit before the session begins is like watching a very specific kind of athlete perform their signature skill in real time. The net leaves his hand in a controlled rotation, spreads into its full circle in the air, and settles over the target dummy at the edge of the training floor with a soft, capturing whisper that is nothing like the dramatic swirling throw of the movie version and everything like the precise, controlled arc of someone who has done this 10,000 times. You are the target dummy, as of this morning. Congratulations. The first thing Aquila teaches you, not intentionally, but through the experience of being his training partner, is that the retiarius's most dangerous weapon is not the net. It is not the trident, either, though the trident deserves significant respect, its 3 prongs making it simultaneously a reaching, probing weapon and a device for controlling distance and pinning limbs and equipment. The most dangerous weapon the retiarius carries is the fact that he has already read you, and has been reading you since you walked onto the training floor, and every small piece of information your body has given away in the 30 seconds since you faced each other, your weight distribution, your grip on the scutum, the angle of your helmet, the slight leftward lean you have when you're uncertain, is already being filed and will be retrieved at exactly the moment it causes you the most trouble. This is what makes the retiarius stylistically alien to the secutor's training. The retiarius fights forward in time in a way that the close-quarters gladius styles don't require. A murmillo or secutor fights in the present moment, the exchange happening now, the guard and strike and recover in immediate response to immediate stimulus. The retiarius fights a version of you that is 3 seconds in the future, setting up the cast or the thrust not for this moment but for the moment he has calculated you will be in a specific position relative to him. He is a chess player in a world of checkers players, and learning to disrupt his calculations without revealing your own is one of the deepest skills the secutor/retiarius pairing demands. Strabo watches the first session with Aquila from a position that gives him sight lines on both fighters simultaneously, and his expression throughout is one of pure diagnostic concentration. He is seeing things in this exchange that you are not seeing, collecting information about your responses and tendencies and instinctive patterns that he will convert into specific training prescriptions. When the session ends, earlier than you expected, Strabo calling a halt before either of you has fully extended your effort, which turns out to be a deliberate choice to preserve something for analysis rather than exhausting it, he speaks to both of you in turn. To Aquila, something brief and technical. To you, something slightly longer that takes a moment to translate. He says, "You are fighting the net. Stop fighting the net. Fight the man." This is the kind of instruction that sounds simple and contains an entire philosophy. The secutor who focuses on the net, who tracks it, who flinches toward it, who organizes his advance around the threat of being caught in it, has already lost the cognitive battle because the retiarius has successfully made the net the center of your attention, which is precisely where he needs your attention to be while he does something else with the trident. The secutor who fights the man, who advances on the fighter himself, whose focus stays on the body behind the weapons rather than the weapons themselves, forces the retiarius to make decisions rather than execute plans, and decisions under pressure are where mistakes happen. This principle, attend to the person, not the tool, appears in various forms across the technical literature of multiple fighting traditions across multiple centuries, and the fact that Strabo is teaching it here in a Roman gladiatorial school in the 2nd century CE tells you something about how fundamental it is to the experience of one human being trying to manage the threat of another. Historians still argue whether the Roman gladiatorial tradition had a formal written technical literature, a treatise on the art of gladiatorial combat, that has simply been lost, or whether the technical knowledge was entirely oral and practical, transmitted from doctorus to fighter in the way Strabo is transmitting it to you right now. The absence of such a text in the surviving record is itself notable, and its implications are contested. The business dimension of everything Strabo is doing, and everything Aquila represents, becomes more visible to you around this time, as your understanding of the ludus deepens enough to perceive the economic machinery running beneath the surface of daily life. The gladiatorial games were not a public entertainment funded by civic generosity and managed by neutral administrators. They were a specific intersection of politics, commerce, personal ambition, and crowd psychology that involved an enormous number of interested parties, all of whom had different things at stake and different mechanisms for extracting value from the spectacle. At the top of the structure, during the imperial period, sat the emperor himself. The ludi publici, the public games, were deeply embedded in the political identity of Roman emperorship, and the quality and scale of the games a given emperor sponsored was a direct statement about his power, his relationship with the Roman people, and his willingness to perform the role of generous patron of public entertainment. Emperors competed with their predecessors in the extravagance of their games, which produced an escalating arms race of spectacle that the Roman economy sustained with remarkable tenacity for several centuries. The opening of the Colosseum under Titus in 80 CE was celebrated with 100 days of games, during which thousands of gladiators fought and an improbable number of exotic animals were killed in the arena. Estimates for the animal deaths range from 9,000 upward, which staggers the imagination and should also probably stagger our environmental sensibility, though that particular category of Roman criticism is anachronistic enough to require careful handling. Below the emperor sat the politicians and wealthy private citizens, the editors, the sponsors of individual games, who funded gladiatorial spectacles as a form of political currency. The gladiatorial munus was at its heart a gift to the Roman people, and the Roman people were expected to register this gift in their political support and public opinion of the giver. An editor who put on spectacular games could expect his popularity to rise, his political ambitions to be advanced, his name to be spoken favorably in the places where Roman public opinion formed. Julius Caesar, before he was Caesar in the full historical sense, used gladiatorial games as a systematic political investment with a clarity of intent that his contemporaries found alarming and his biographers found entirely characteristic. The lanista sat somewhere in the structure as the supplier, the man with the product, and his negotiations with editors were commercial transactions conducted with the hard-nosed pragmatism of any supplier-client relationship where the client has political power and the supplier has something they need. The price of a gladiatorial show was substantial and documented in surviving legal sources. The cost of individual fighters varied enormously based on their record, their reputation, their fighting style, and the current supply and demand for specific types. A successful, well-known fighter could command fees that made him an extremely valuable asset, which is why the ludus's medical investment in keeping fighters alive and functional was not charity but rational economic strategy. The fighters themselves occupied the bottom of this economic structure in terms of direct financial benefit, but the picture was not as simple as pure exploitation. Gladiators who survived and built reputations received a portion of the prize money, the weapons and armor awarded symbolically after a victory, which could be converted to cash or retained as property. Some gladiators accumulated significant personal wealth over careers of 5, 10, or more fights. The legal framework around gladiatorial contracts, particularly for free volunteers, included provisions for payment, and the evidence suggests these provisions were honored at least inconsistently, which is the most honest assessment of Roman institutional reliability you're likely to find. There was also the prize money from the editor directly, the gold or silver coins that a victorious fighter received as an award on top of any other payment. These were public presentations, done in front of the crowd, and the amounts were calibrated to the crowd's expectation of appropriate generosity from the game sponsor. Too small an award was a statement about the editor's miserliness that the crowd would register and remember. Too large was wasteful in a way that didn't serve political purposes any better than adequate. The calibration was part of the performance, and the performance was, as always, primarily political. The freedom question, manumission, the possibility of legal liberation, hovered over all of this for the enslaved fighters in a way that is documented but complex. A slave gladiator who was formally freed received the rudis, the wooden training sword, awarded symbolically as a marker of liberation from gladiatorial service and legal free status. Some fighters achieved this. The conditions under which it was granted varied by individual case, by the preferences of the lanista, by the legal category of the fighter's enslavement, and by factors that the surviving record doesn't always make clear. The wooden rudis as a symbol of earned freedom is one of the most powerful images in the entire gladiatorial tradition, and it was powerful specifically because it was not automatic, not guaranteed, not a known destination that every fighter could be confident of reaching if they simply lasted long enough. Free volunteers who had completed their contracted service had a cleaner exit path in theory, though the evidence suggests that many re-enlisted, sometimes because the economics of life outside the ludus were less favorable than the economics of life inside it. The pay, the food, the medical care, the strange social celebrity of the arena, and sometimes because the identity of the fighter had become the primary identity in a way that civilian life couldn't accommodate. Aquila, you learn from Corvus one evening, is a free volunteer on his second contract. He came from a coastal city in North Africa, worked as a fisherman's assistant before making his way to Italy, signed the Octoramentum at 22, completed his first 3-year contract, took 3 weeks to think about it, and signed again. When Corvus tells you this, you watch Aquila across the courtyard practicing his net recovery with the focused patience of a craftsman, and you try to imagine the calculation that produced the second signature. The 3 weeks of thinking, the weighing. The economics of the business ran right down to the individual fighter's decision-making in this way, and the decision-making was rarely simple even when the alternatives seemed obvious. The ludus was a total institution. It provided everything, demanded everything, and in providing everything created a dependency that was sometimes material and sometimes psychological, and usually both simultaneously. Freedom from the ludus meant freedom to face a world that had none of the ludus's provisions and all of the ludus's indifference. And for a man who had built his entire adult identity around the institution's rhythms, that freedom could feel less like liberation and more like a different kind of exposure. You think about Aquila's second signature while you oil your scutum straps in the evening lamplight. You think about the 3 weeks. You think about what he saw during those 3 weeks that made the second contract make more sense than the alternative. The net folds on the floor beside your equipment, the practice version you've been permitted to handle in order to understand its weight and geometry from the inside out. Strabo's instruction, fight the man, not the net, sits in your mind alongside everything else this place has given you. Outside, the Roman world is conducting its commerce and its politics and its public life, and inside these walls that world is refracted through the specific lens of the gladiatorial economy, where everything, your training, your diet, your medical care, your future, Aquila's second signature, connects back to the machinery of public spectacle. Tomorrow, Strabo has indicated the paired training intensifies. Aquila will work at closer to full capability. The net will be weighted. The trident will be the full practice version. The economics of the business require that you get better faster. The crowd is eventually going to want to see what it has paid for. The notice comes on a morning that begins like every other morning. Bell, courtyard, gray sky, porridge, but announces itself as different through the specific quality of silence that falls over the training floor when the senior doctorus reads from a wax tablet at the start of the session. You don't need the translation to understand that something has changed. You can read it in the way the experienced fighters receive the information. Not with visible fear, not with excitement exactly, but with a kind of careful stilling, the way a room of people stills when the weather outside makes a sound that means something. The names are read. Yours is among them. In 12 days, you will fight in the arena at Capua. 12 days is both a long time and no time at all, and the ludus treats it as both simultaneously. The training in the final days before an arena appearance is simultaneously the most intense you have experienced and the most carefully managed, because the goal is to arrive at the day of the fight in peak physical condition, which means pushing hard enough to sharpen what the weeks of preparation have built without pushing so hard that you damage something that needs to be functional in 12 days. Strabo adjusts the sessions with a precision that reflects long experience of this calibration. More sparring, less conditioning. More technical refinement, less raw endurance work. The body is being tuned rather than built now, and the distinction matters. What nobody prepares you for, what no amount of technical training addresses, is the psychological architecture of the 12 days. The fight was always theoretical until this moment. It was the destination that the training pointed toward, the implicit purpose of every session with the Paulus and every drill with the scutum and every exchange with Aquila's practice net. But it existed in the future in a way that allowed you to engage with the preparation while maintaining a comfortable cognitive distance from the thing being prepared for. Now the distance has collapsed and the thing is 12 days away and 10 days away and 7, and the arithmetic of the countdown is doing something to the quality of your sleep and the quality of your attention and the specific flavor of your relationship with your own heartbeat. The Roman world had a rich tradition of pre-combat ritual that the gladiatorial culture absorbed and adapted into its own specific vocabulary of preparation, and the 12 days leading up to the fight were structured around this ritual as much as around the physical preparation. The rituals were not purely psychological comfort, though they were that too. They were also public performance, part of the spectacle economy, and they began publicly enough with the Pampa, the ceremonial procession, which was still days away, but whose shadow was already present in the way people around you were behaving. The most famous and elaborate of the pre-arena rituals was the Cena Libera, the free dinner, the public banquet given for the gladiators on the evening before the games. This was not a private meal. It was a public event, open to Roman citizens who wished to attend, and it served multiple simultaneous functions that reflect the layered complexity of the gladiatorial institution with characteristic Roman efficiency. For the editor sponsoring the games, it was another opportunity for public generosity. Feeding the fighters in front of the people was a statement about his magnanimity. For the crowd, it was an opportunity to see the fighters up close, to form impressions and opinions that would inform their loyalties the next day. For the fighters, it was theoretically a last good meal, though the phrase last good meal is doing some complicated psychological work in that context that you'd rather not examine too closely. Historical accounts of the Cena Libera describe an atmosphere that was genuinely strange. Festive and anxious simultaneously, the crowd eating and drinking and talking with the fighters in a social proximity that the arena itself would not permit, and the fighters navigating this contact with varying degrees of composure. Some gladiators, according to ancient sources, ate and drank with apparent enjoyment, performing the role of confident professional with convincing ease. Others sat quietly and ate little, which the watching crowd interpreted according to their own preferences, either brave stoicism or evidence that the man knew something about his own chances that the crowd didn't. Some, apparently, talked too much, in the specific way that people talk too much when the alternative is sitting alone with their thoughts in a room full of strangers staring at them. You think, in the days before the Cena Libera, about which version of yourself is going to walk into that room. The question is not trivial. The performance at the dinner is the first public performance, the first moment when you exist as a fighter in the eyes of the Roman public rather than inside the institutional privacy of the ludus, and the impression you make will travel ahead of you into the arena. The crowd at gladiatorial games was not passive. They were deeply invested, knowledgeable by the standards of regular attendance, and capable of reading a fighter with a sophistication born of extensive practice. They had seen hundreds of men walk into that dinner. They knew what confident looked like and what false confidence looked like, and they had opinions about both. Corvus, who has fought twice and is not on the list for this set of games, sits with you on the evening of the 7th day before the fight and tells you something he says he wished someone had told him before his first appearance. He says, "The crowd is not your enemy and they are not your friend. They are the weather. You do not fight the weather. You do not perform for the weather. You exist inside it and you let it be what it is and you focus on the man in front of you. The crowd will do what crowds do. Your job is smaller than you think and more specific. Your job is what Strabo has spent months teaching you to do." He pauses, works the leather in his hands for a moment, then adds, "Also, do not eat the oysters at the Cena Libera if they smell like the Tiber at low tide. This is practical wisdom that the historical record does not specifically preserve but which you receive with the gravity it deserves." The night before the games, the actual night, the 12-hour stretch between the Cena Libera and the morning of the Munera, has a texture that everyone who has experienced it describes differently and everyone who hasn't imagines incorrectly. You expected, perhaps, a dramatic dark night of the soul, the kind of spiritual reckoning that the movies tend to locate in this space. The fighter alone with the stars, making peace with mortality, composing himself for the trial ahead. What you find instead is something more human and more exhausting. A night that will not move at the pace you need it to move, populated by thoughts that are neither profound nor comfortable, in a body that is too alert for sleep and too tired for useful wakefulness. The ludus is quieter than usual. Not silent, it never quite achieves silence, but a different quality of sound, the ordinary night noises present but subdued, as though the building itself is aware that something significant is scheduled for the morning. Several of the fighters who are not on tomorrow's list have found reasons to be elsewhere, not from cruelty but from a kind of tact. The institutional understanding that the night before the games belongs to the people who are in them and that the rest of the population should make themselves appropriately small. You lie on your straw mat, the same straw, the same platform you have been sleeping on since your first night, and you run through the technical sequence that Strabo has built into your muscle memory over the preceding months. Not consciously, not as a deliberate rehearsal, but the way trained patterns resurface in quiet moments, the advance, the shield position, the response to the cast, the counter when the net misses, the way to collapse distance before Aquila, or whoever is across the sand from you tomorrow, can reset for the trident. Your body knows these things. That is the whole point of what the ludus has done to you. Your body knows these things so that tomorrow, when the environment outside these walls is doing everything it can to flood your system with chemicals that impair decision-making and fine motor control, the things that matter most will be below the threshold where chemicals interfere with them. The Romans understood this intuitively without the neuroscientific framework to describe it. The whole logic of the gladiatorial training system, the months of repetition, the progression from wooden post to blunted iron to full capability, the controlled stress of sparring, the increasing stakes of the exercises was a program for moving essential skills below the waterline of conscious control, where fear couldn't reach them. Fear was going to be present tomorrow. Fear was not optional and not something the Romans wasted effort trying to eliminate. The goal was to have the important things happen underneath it. The superstitions in the room are real and various and completely human. The man in the cell next to yours is a fighter named Bassus who has a sequence of specific actions he performs before any arena appearance, a particular arrangement of his personal objects, a specific series of prayers to a specific deity, in his case Hercules, the divine patron most closely associated with gladiatorial culture, though Nemesis, the goddess of fate and retribution, maintained a significant cult following in gladiatorial communities across the Roman world, and a small object, a worn bronze disc that he handles briefly and then places under his sleeping mat for the night. He has done this before his 2 previous appearances, and he is still alive, and therefore the sequence will be performed again tonight with the full conviction of a man who knows that correlation and causation are indistinguishable in the dark at midnight the night before you might die. The theology of the Roman world offered gladiators a rich vocabulary for engaging with the spiritual dimensions of their situation, and the evidence from gladiatorial cemeteries and shrines associated with Ludi shows that fighters were active participants in this vocabulary. Inscriptions from gladiatorial contexts invoke a wider range of deities than you might expect. Hercules and Nemesis were common, as were Mercury, in his role as conductor of souls, Mars, and various local and imported deities whose cults had found their way into the gladiatorial community through the international composition of the fighters. The ludus at Capua alone would have contained men from Italy, North Africa, the Iberian Peninsula, Gaul, the Germanic territories, Greece, Thrace, and various points further east, and each of them carried their own religious background into the institution. And the institution accommodated this with the pragmatic pluralism that characterized Roman religious culture at its best. Historians still argue whether the specific gladiatorial cult sites, the small shrines found in and adjacent to gladiatorial facilities across the empire, represent official institutional provision of religious infrastructure or organic community development, fighters creating their own sacred spaces within the limits the institution allowed. The answer is probably both, in proportions that varied by facility and period. Your own relationship with the divine dimension of tomorrow is complicated. You have not, in your months at the ludus, developed the kind of easy familiarity with any particular deity that Bassus has with Hercules, and the manufactured conviction of a prayer you don't feel comfortable with seems worse than the honest uncertainty of saying nothing formal. What you find yourself doing instead, in the small hours of the night, is something that has no theological name but is recognizable. You think about specific people. Not abstractly, not as a category of concern, but individually, their faces, their voices, the particular texture of knowing them. You hold them in your mind for a while, in the way that people hold things they might not see again. The morning will bring the pampa, the procession through the city streets from wherever the gladiators have assembled to the arena entrance, public and ceremonial and watched by crowds who are already forming their opinions. The pampa was a significant public ritual, and the fighters moved through it with the awareness of people who understood that the procession was itself a performance, that they were already in the show before they reached the sand. They were dressed for visibility, clean equipment, gleaming metal. The specific visual grammar of their fighting styles declared in what they carried and wore, and the crowd along the route registered what they saw and made assessments and placed whatever bets had not already been placed the night before. Betting on gladiatorial matches was both extremely common and technically of questionable legal status in Roman law, occupying one of those characteristically Roman gray zones where what everyone does and what the law technically says exist in productive tension with each other. The crowd had opinions about the fighters based on their records, their reputations, the physical impressions of the pampa, and the various forms of insider information that circulated in the economy of the games. The odds were set somewhere in this information environment, and money moved accordingly, and the editor knew that the financial interests in the crowd were among the factors shaping the emotional temperature of the day. Going into tomorrow, the basics of what will happen and what will not happen, at least in statistical terms. The movies have given everyone the impression that the gladiatorial arena was a death machine, that most fights ended with a body being carried out on a stretcher and the survivors wiping blood off their blades with an expression of noble exhaustion. The reality, as the evidence increasingly suggests, was considerably more nuanced. Death in the arena was real and documented. Gladiatorial epitaphs exist, gladiatorial graves exist, and the Ephesus cemetery is literally full of them. But death as the standard outcome of a gladiatorial match appears to have been less common than the dramatic tradition suggests. The economics provide one explanation. Dead gladiators were expensive to replace and represented the total loss of a significant investment. The editor who sponsored the games paid the lanista a substantial fee for the fighter's appearance, and if a fighter died, the editor was additionally responsible for paying the lanista a death fee, an indemnification for the loss of the asset that was significantly higher than the appearance fee. This financial structure created a direct incentive for the editor to avoid unnecessary deaths, because each death cost him money on top of the appearance costs. The crowd, meanwhile, had emotional investments in specific fighters, favorites built over repeated appearances, and the death of a popular fighter was not necessarily the crowd-pleasing outcome that the movies suggest. None of this means death was not possible tomorrow. It was possible. The equipment was real, the opponents were trained, and the outcomes of physical combat are not entirely predictable even in the most controlled conditions. But the probability was shaped by forces that ran in a more complex direction than simple kill or be killed, and understanding those forces is part of what the Ludus has given you. The straw mat, the warm stone smell of the room, the bronze disc under Bassus's mat, and the sound of his breathing settling toward sleep in the cell next door. The sequence running through your muscle memory in the dark. Advance, shield, read the cast, collapse the distance, fight the man. Corvus's voice, from the evening. The crowd is the weather. Your job is smaller than you think. The night moves. Slowly, then less slowly, then with the peculiar acceleration of the last hours before something significant, when sleep has finally taken you in the brief window before the bell and you are in the thin, vivid dreams of a body that knows the bell is coming. And then it comes. Iron on iron, flat and hard, bouncing off every stone surface simultaneously. And this time, the morning is different from every other morning. This time, you rise and the equipment waiting at the foot of your mat is not practice equipment. The equipment is heavier than the practice versions in a way that is partly physical and partly something else. The real scutum, the real helmet, the real gladius in its scabbard at your hip, carrying a weight of implication that the blunted training versions never had. You dress with a care that is not vanity but attention, the same quality of attention you've learned to bring to every technical element of what this place has trained you to do, because the equipment is also your survival and survival deserves careful attention. The helmet goes on last, the chin strap checked twice, the vision through the face guard narrower than you'd like and exactly as narrow as you've trained with, the familiar reduction of peripheral vision that Strabo spent weeks helping you compensate for with increased head movement and the specific scanning pattern that keeps the environment legible inside the constraints of the guard. Around you, the others on the day's list are doing the same thing, dressing with the same careful attention, checking the same fastenings, each man inside his own version of this morning's particular quality of silence. Nobody is making speeches. Nobody is offering dramatic encouragement or theatrical expressions of brotherhood. There is a kind of respect in this silence, the respect of people who understand that what each of them is carrying this morning is not shareable in any meaningful way and doesn't require the performance of sharing. The pampa assembles in the gray, early light outside the Ludus gates, and you walk through the streets of Capua toward the arena in a procession that is already being watched. The crowd along the route is thinner than it will be at the arena itself. The serious spectators are already finding their seats, but they are present and they look at you with the frank, assessing attention of people who have done this before, who know how to read the procession, who are making their final evaluations before the gates open. You look straight ahead the way Corvus told you to look, not because looking at the crowd is dangerous, but because looking at the crowd is a kind of engagement that costs something you need for later, and the morning is young and the account is not yet open for withdrawals. The arena at Capua was not the Colosseum. This is worth establishing clearly because the Colosseum, the Flavian amphitheater, completed under Titus in 80 CE and capable of holding somewhere between 50 and 80,000 spectators depending on which ancient source and which modern archaeologist you ask, was the apex of Roman arena architecture, and most gladiatorial combat happened in considerably more modest venues. The Capua amphitheater was nonetheless significant. It was one of the largest in the Roman world outside Rome itself, with an estimated capacity of around 30,000, and its construction in the 1st century CE reflected the city's status as a major center of gladiatorial culture. The building that holds 30,000 people watching you is, from your perspective this morning, not particularly consoling to think about in terms of scale, so you elect not to think about it in those terms. The hypogeum, the underground network of passages and chambers beneath the arena floor, receives you through a gated entrance that swallows the procession from the street and delivers you into a different world. Underground, the sounds of the city disappear and are replaced by the sounds of the arena's operational machinery, the movement of animals in their holding areas, the voices of arena staff managing equipment and logistics, the low, structural vibration of a crowd above you that has been building since before you arrived and is now a physical presence in the stone, a trembling that comes through the soles of your feet and reminds you, with uncomfortable specificity, of exactly how many people are currently sitting above your head. The Romans engineered the hypogeum with remarkable sophistication. The Colosseum's underground system, the best preserved and most extensively studied, included a network of corridors, lifts operated by counterweight systems, holding cages for animals and fighters, and the mechanical infrastructure for the scenic elements that made Roman arena spectacles visually elaborate events. The Capua system was less complex but operated on the same basic principles. A managed backstage for a very large and very expensive public performance. You move through it with the other fighters, guided by arena staff who know the layout and whose job today is logistics, getting the right people to the right place at the right time with the professional efficiency of people running a complicated event that happens on a regular schedule. In the holding area, waiting for your match to be called, the sounds from above intensify. The morning's program has already begun. The games typically opened with preliminary events before the main gladiatorial bouts, including animal hunts called venations and, in some contexts, other forms of combat, and the crowd's responses to whatever is happening on the sand above you arrive as waves of sound that the stone amplifies and distorts into something almost geological, a deep, rhythmic pressure that your body reads before your mind processes it. Bassus is 2 positions ahead of you in the waiting order. He is doing the sequence, the arrangement of objects, the prayer, the bronze disc now in his hand rather than under his mat. He does it with the same focused completeness with which he did it last night, and the man next to him watches without comment, with the respect that competence in any ritual deserves from an observer. You watch too, and you find that watching is useful, not because you believe in Bassus's particular sequence, but because the act of watching someone else perform their preparation with conviction is itself a form of anchoring, a reminder that there are methods for navigating this moment and that methods are available to you. Your method, when it comes, is simpler than Bassus's and more continuous. You have been doing it since the bell this morning without naming it as a method. You think in sequences, the advance, the shield position, the reading of the retiarius's weight distribution that tells you whether the cast is coming now or in 3 steps. The response when it does come, the lateral movement that takes you off the net's line while maintaining the forward pressure toward the man. Fight the man. Your job is smaller than you think. You do not know who is across the sand from you today. This is another aspect of the gladiatorial experience that the movies consistently get wrong. The pairing of fighters for a given day's games was managed at the organizational level by the lanista in negotiation with the editor, and the specific matchups were known to the administration and advertised on the painted game bills that appeared on city walls weeks before the event, But the fighters themselves were not always given advance notice of their specific opponent, particularly for less senior bouts. You know, your style and your assignment secutor matched against a retiarius because that is the traditional pairing, but the specific man, his record, his tendencies, his particular version of Aquila's style is going to introduce himself to you on the sand. This uncertainty was not accidental. The gladiatorial matching system balanced several considerations simultaneously. The crowd wanted competitive matches, not foregone conclusions, which meant pairing fighters of roughly equivalent experience and capability was in everyone's commercial interest. The linicity of both fighters had reputations to protect. A fighter who lost consistently to obviously overmatched opponents was a depreciated asset, and so the matching process involved a negotiated assessment of relative quality that the Romans took seriously enough to develop quasi-official records of fights and outcomes. The inscriptions that survive from the Roman world documenting gladiatorial careers record wins, losses, draws, and in some cases the specific number of fights, allowing a rough career progression to be traced for individual fighters. A man with 20 recorded bouts was not matched against a first-timer without both fighters' linicity having something specific in mind for the outcome. Historians still argue whether the gladiatorial matching system had enough formal organization to be called a ranking system in any modern sense, or whether it was a more fluid, negotiated, and situationally variable process. The evidence is consistent with both interpretations and not definitive enough to settle the question cleanly. The sound from above shifts. A different frequency, a different pattern, the crowd responding to something that has ended, the reset between events that you've been told to listen for. Your section of the waiting order moves forward. You are 2 bouts away, then 1. The gate at the end of the hypogeum corridor is banded iron and heavy wood, and light comes through its gaps in moving, shifting columns that tell you the sand on the other side is in direct sun. Italian morning sun, full and specific and nothing like the filtered, apologetic light of the underground. Through the gate you can hear the crowd not as geological vibration but as individual voices aggregated into mass sound. The specific human roar that 30,000 people produce when they are excited and together and focused on the same thing. The gate opens, and you walk through it into the light, into the sand, into the sound. The transition from underground to arena is one of the most written about experiential moments in the gladiatorial literature, by scholars who are reconstructing it from fragments and by the occasional ancient source who thought to describe it. And the consistent element across all these accounts is the scale of the sensory shift, the sudden expansion from the close, stone-smelling dark of the hypogeum into the vast, open, sun-drenched bowl of the amphitheater, surrounded on all sides by ascending tiers of people who are looking specifically at you. Your eyes adjust. The sand underfoot is not the packed clay of the training floor. It is actual sand, fine, pale, slightly soft under your sandals, and it has been freshly raked for the day's events, which gives it an almost domestic neatness that contrasts sharply with what it is about to be used for. The crowd takes you in with the practiced eye of an experienced audience. They read your equipment, your build, your movement, the way you carry the scutum, the set of your shoulders, the quality of your walk across the sand to your position. They are making assessments in real time, and the assessments are audible in the changing texture of the crowd sound, individual responses building into collective reaction. Someone near the lower seating section calls something that you can't parse linguistically but understand tonally. The crowd has received you. The show has begun. Across the sand, your opponent has entered from the opposite gate. The retiarius. He is taller than Aquila, leaner, and he moves with a particular loose-hipped fluidity that tells you immediately, the body language reading that months of training have built into your perception, that he is comfortable in this space. He has been here before. His net hangs from his left hand in a casual loop. The trident rests on his right shoulder at an angle that looks relaxed and is not relaxed at all. And he looks at you across 30 meters of pale sand with the professional attention of a craftsman appraising the day's work. The editor's box, elevated, shaded, occupied by the man whose money made this day happen, is visible at the arena's long axis. The editor himself is visible as a specific figure within it, and he is currently doing what Roman editors did during the games. Watching, performing the watching, because his visible engagement with the spectacle was itself part of the day's performance. He was the generous patron, the civic benefactor, present and attentive and gratified by the crowd's gratitude, which was itself being expressed in real time in the sounds the 30,000 people were making. The referee, the summa rudis, the senior official with the long wooden staff who managed the bout, stands at the edge of the sand, waiting. There was a formal, organized officiating structure for gladiatorial bouts that modern audiences consistently underestimate. The summa rudis and his assistant could pause the fight, separate fighters who had clinched or fallen, and manage the conduct of the bout according to recognized rules. The gladiatorial fight was not simply two men told to resolve the situation. It had structure, it had officials, it had a framework of regulated conduct that the fighters were expected to operate within, and departures from that framework could be penalized. The summa rudis raises his staff. The crowd sound shifts, dropping in the specific way that a large group of people drop their conversations when something they have been waiting for is about to happen. You have been in this moment in your head for 12 days. You have rehearsed it in muscle memory for months before that. You have eaten the barley porridge and swung the wooden rudis at the wooden palus and held the guard position until your arm stopped working and held it longer, and Strabo's 2 fingers have corrected your elbow more times than you can count. And Corvus has told you about the weather and your job is smaller than you think and fight the man and all of it was for this. The staff comes down. The retiarius begins to move and you begin to move and the sand is pale and soft underfoot and the sun is full and Italian and the crowd is 30,000 people breathing together. And the months collapse into a single point of present tense attention that is the cleanest, most complete awareness you have ever experienced. No past, no future, no walls, no bell, no porridge, no straw mat, no wax tablet with your name on the list. Just the man across the sand. Just the net beginning to swing in slow preliminary circles. Just the distance between you closing. Strabo's voice in your muscle memory. Fight the man. You advance. The net sings through the air. You move. And whether you are still standing when the next wave of crowd sound arrives, whether the sand beneath you holds a victory or the beginning of a supplication, whether the editor's hand goes to his heart or his thumb finds another direction, whether the summa rudis steps in or steps back, that is a question that belongs to the particular mercy or indifference of the Roman afternoon, and to whatever the 30,000 people decide they have seen, and to the 10,000 contingencies of 2 trained bodies moving in the same space at the same time. What you know, standing in the light after months in the shadow of the ludus, is that you are more than you were when the gates closed behind you. Not invincible, not guaranteed, but more capable, more present, more specifically yourself in the way that only genuine trial tends to produce. The institution took you and processed you and built you into something it needed, and in the process of doing that it gave you, without intending to, something it couldn't take back. The sand remembers everyone who has ever stood on it. The walls of this amphitheater have absorbed the sound of decades of crowds. Somewhere under this floor, the bones of the underground infrastructure hold the weight of everything that happened above them, and will continue to hold it long after today's sand has been raked clean and tomorrow's fighters have taken your place and the editor has gone home to calculate whether the investment in the day's games has produced the political return he was looking for. Rome goes on. The games go on. The bell will ring again tomorrow for someone. But right now, in this specific sunlit moment on this particular pale sand, with the crowd's breath held in the instant between the net's release and whatever comes next. Right now, you are here, and you are, against all reasonable expectation, still standing. Let the sand fade now. Let the crowd's roar soften, like a television being turned down one slow notch at a time, until it is just a murmur, and then just a hum, and then just the memory of a sound. You have been through something tonight. Not really, of course, you were safe in your bed the whole time, which is honestly quite a good place to be when the alternative involves nets and tridents and 30,000 Romans with opinions. But your mind traveled, and traveling takes something out of you, even when the journey is made entirely in the imagination. Especially then, perhaps. Let the Roman sun go. Let Capua dissolve. Let the ludus, with its high walls and its bell and its barley porridge and its patient wooden palus, recede into the comfortable distance of the past, where it has always been, where it will remain, holding its history quietly in its stones. The people who walked through those gates, the ones who came as slaves and soldiers and desperate volunteers, who ate the barley and swung the rudis and learned from the doctorus how to hold an elbow and how to read a man's weight and how to fight with the good parts of their mind rather than the frightened parts. They are worth remembering. Not as spectacle, as people. Specific, complicated, surprisingly well-nourished people who found ways to be human inside a system that was not primarily interested in their humanity, and who managed it with a grace that the historical record, in its fragmentary and incomplete way, occasionally lets us glimpse. Your bed is comfortable. Your morning is far away. The fan, if you turned one on, is doing its steady, unhurried work, and the sound of it is as far from an iron bell as a sound can get. There is nothing you need to do right now. Nowhere you need to be. No bell is coming. The sand is still. The crowd is quiet. The Roman stars are out, indifferent and ancient and very, very beautiful. Sleep now. You've earned it.